Ever have one of those moments where you walk into a room and instantly know you're about to become the center of unwanted attention? Where every eye seems to scan you like you're a puzzle they can't quite solve, and you can practically feel the whispers starting before you've even taken 3 steps. That's exactly what happened to Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez on what should have been an ordinary Tuesday morning at Fort Meridian. But what started as snickers about her wrinkled uniform ended with a major general reading her classified code name out loud. And suddenly every soldier in that room realized they had just made the biggest mistake of their military careers. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. You see, Elena wasn't supposed to be there at all. She was supposed to be halfway across the country, deep in the Colorado mountains, running survival training for the next batch of recruits who thought they were tough enough to handle what the wilderness could throw at them. But sometimes life has other plans, and sometimes those plans involve emergency, family situations that pull you away from your assigned duties and drop you into places where you don't quite fit the mold. She'd been driving for 18 hours straight, her government-issued sedan eating up miles of interstate highway, surviving on truck stop coffee and the kind of determination that only comes from knowing someone you love needs you. Her sister Carmen was in the hospital, complications from what was supposed to be routine surgery, and Elena had gotten emergency leave to be there. The problem was, Carmen was stationed at Fort Meridian, and Elena's travel orders were rushed, her paperwork hastily processed, and her usual meticulous appearance standards had taken a backseat to getting there as fast as humanly possible. Fort Meridian wasn't like the mountain training facilities Elena was used to. This was a sprawling administrative hub, the kind of place where appearances mattered more than capabilities, where fresh creases and polished boots were the currency of respect. It was all gleaming buildings and perfectly manicured lawns, populated by soldiers who had never seen a day of actual field work but could recite regulations like poetry. The kind of place where a wrinkled uniform stood out like a beacon, screaming, "Doesn't belong here," to anyone with eyes to see. Elena had pulled into the visitor parking lot at 0630 hours, her uniform looking like she'd slept in it, which, to be fair, she essentially had. During her marathon drive, she'd caught maybe 3 hours of sleep in the car at a rest stop somewhere in Kansas, and her usually pristine battle dress uniform showed every mile of that journey. The fabric was creased in all the wrong places, her boots were dusty from the gravel parking lot, and her normally perfect military bearing was softened by exhaustion and worry. She needed to check in with the duty officer, get her visitor credentials, and find her way to the base hospital. Simple tasks that should have taken 15 minutes max. But the moment she walked through the doors of the main administrative building, she could feel the shift in atmosphere. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Soldiers doing their morning routines suddenly found reasons to look in her direction. It was like walking into a room where everyone had been talking about you, and your arrival had just confirmed their worst suspicions. The building itself was a monument to military bureaucracy. Polished floors that reflected the fluorescent lights, walls lined with portraits of distinguished officers from decades past, and the kind of silence that only comes from people who spend their days pushing paper and following protocols. Everything was regulation perfect, from the precisely positioned furniture to the soldiers moving through the corridors with the kind of measured steps that suggested they were always aware of being watched and judged. Elena's wrinkled appearance was like a stone thrown into still water, creating ripples of attention that spread outward from her position. She could hear the whispers starting, not loud enough to be insubordinate, but definitely loud enough for her to catch fragments. Comments about standards slipping, about how some people just didn't take pride in their appearance, about how the mountain units were apparently letting things slide. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly know, was that the Woman they were dismissing as sloppy had a service record that would make their heads spin. Elena Vasquez wasn't just another soldier having a bad uniform day. She was a veteran of operations that didn't officially exist, a holder of commendations that were buried so deep in classified files that most generals didn't even know they had been awarded. Her last name wasn't even Vasquez in certain databases. It was a cover identity, maintained for security reasons, that went far beyond anything these administrative soldiers would ever need to understand, but none of that was visible to the naked eye. All they could see was a tired woman in a wrinkled uniform, and in their world, that was enough to make a judgment. They had no idea that within the hour, their comfortable little world of regulations and appearances was about to be turned completely upside down by a major general who would recognize not just Elena's real identity, but the significance of the code name that came with it. The morning sun was streaming through the tall windows of the administrative building, casting long shadows across the polished floors, and Elena Vasquez was about to become the main character in a story that would be retold in military circles for years to come. Because sometimes, the most dangerous mistake you can make is assuming that what you see on the surface tells the whole story. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Elena wasn't at Fort Meridian to impress anyone or prove anything. She had one simple, urgent mission: get to her sister's bedside as fast as possible. The emergency leave paperwork in her jacket pocket told the whole story. Carmen Vasquez, hospitalized due to surgical complications, condition stable but requiring family presence. Nothing heroic, nothing classified. Just a big sister doing what big sisters do when their family needs them. The drive from Mountain Pine Training Facility in Colorado had been a blur of highway markers and truck stops. Elena had left immediately after receiving the Red Cross message, barely taking time to grab her go-bag and inform her commanding officer. There hadn't been time for proper uniform preparation, no opportunity to stop at the base cleaners, no chance to pack the way she normally would for any official travel. This wasn't a deployment or a training exercise. It was life happening, messy and urgent and completely indifferent to military standards. Her original plan had been straightforward: check in at the visitor center, get her temporary base, access credentials, drive straight to Meridian General Hospital, and spend as much time as possible with Carmen before the doctors made their next assessment. Elena had made this calculation a dozen times during the drive: minimize time on administrative tasks, maximize time where it actually mattered. She figured she'd be in and out of the main building in 10 minutes, maybe 15 if there was a line. The paperwork in her folder was legitimate but rushed. Emergency leave orders signed by Colonel Hendricks, travel authorization stamped with the appropriate codes, medical notification from the Red Cross with Carmen's patient information. Everything was official and properly processed, but it had all been done at speed, with the kind of urgency that doesn't always align with the peacetime military's love of perfect documentation. The orders were valid, but they looked exactly like what they were: papers processed quickly by people who understood that sometimes family emergencies don't wait for proper bureaucratic procedures. Elena's BDUs told the story of her journey. The fabric showed wrinkles from 18 hours of sitting behind the wheel, the creases pressed out of existence by the car seat and replaced by the kind of random folds that come from real wear rather than careful storage. Her boots, normally polished to a mirror shine, were dulled by dust from the gravel parking lot and road salt from 3 different states. Even her normally perfect military bearing showed signs of fatigue: shoulders slightly forward from the drive, movements just a fraction less crisp than they would be after a full night's sleep. She had tried to make some repairs during a bathroom stop in Kansas, straightened her uniform as best she could, finger-combed her regulation bun back into compliance, used wet paper towels to wipe the dust from her boots. But there's only so much you can do at a highway rest stop at 3 in the morning. And Elena knew she looked like exactly what she was, a soldier who had been driving all night to get to a family emergency. The irony wasn't lost on her. Elena Vasquez had spent the last 8 years of her military career in environments where appearance was the least important factor in measuring a soldier's worth. In the mountains of Colorado during survival training, exercises in the field operations that comprised most of her recent service, what mattered was competence, endurance, and the ability to complete the mission regardless of conditions. She had trained soldiers who would later serve in environments where a perfect uniform crease might literally be the difference between life and death, not because it looked good, but because attention to detail in small things translated to attention to detail in critical things. But this wasn't the field, and these weren't her soldiers. This was Fort Meridian, where the most dangerous thing most personnel faced was the possibility of a surprise inspection, and where military bearing was often more about appearance than substance. Elena understood the difference. She'd served in both environments, but right now, family trumped everything else, including the Fort Meridian standard of looking like you'd stepped out of a recruiting poster. The visitor center was her first stop, a small office just inside the main entrance, where civilian family members and official visitors processed their paperwork before being allowed deeper into the base. Elena had her identification ready, her emergency leave orders properly folded, and a clear plan: get credentials, get directions to the hospital, get to Carmen. Simple, straightforward, and completely focused on the only thing that actually mattered in this moment. She had no idea that her wrinkled uniform was about to become the center of attention, or that her simple request for visitor credentials would somehow escalate into a situation that would require intervention from the highest levels of command. All Elena wanted was to see her sister. Everything else was just bureaucracy to be navigated as quickly and quietly as possible. Fort Meridian was a study in military perfection, the kind of installation that existed to showcase what the Army looked like when everything ran according to regulation. Established in 1952 as a strategic communications hub, it had evolved into one of the most important administrative centers on the East Coast, processing everything from personnel transfers to classified intelligence briefings. The base sprawled across nearly 8,000 acres of pristine Virginia countryside, its buildings arranged in precise geometric patterns that looked like they'd been designed by someone with an obsessive love of right angles and symmetrical spacing. The morning air carried the distinctive smell of military efficiency, fresh paint from the weekly building maintenance, the ozone scent of air conditioning units working overtime against the humid Virginia summer, and that particular combination of floor wax and disinfectant that seemed to permeate every military facility built after 1950. Even at 7 in the morning, the base hummed with activity. But it was the kind of controlled, predictable activity that came from years of routine rather than the organized chaos of a combat-ready installation. Elena could hear the rhythm of Fort Meridian as soon as she stepped out of her sedan. Somewhere in the distance, a formation was running PT, their cadence calls echoing off the brick buildings in perfect synchronization. The sound of boots on pavement mixed with the low rumble of staff cars and administrative vehicles moving along the base's network of perfectly maintained roads. Electronic beeps and radio chatter drifted from the communications building, where teams of specialists monitored networks that connected this quiet Virginia base to military operations around the globe. The main administrative building rose 4 stories above the manicured lawns, its red brick facade and white columns designed to project authority and permanence. Every window gleamed in the morning sun, every piece of brass hardware polished to a mirror finish. The American flag and the Army flag flanked the main entrance, hanging motionless in the still morning air, their colors vibrant against the building's formal architecture. Even the sidewalks were pristine, no cracks, no weeds, No evidence that weather or time had been allowed to compromise the installation's appearance. Inside, the building was a temple to military bureaucracy. The floors were polished to such a high sheen that Elena could see her reflection as she walked, her dusty boots creating the first scuff marks of the day on surfaces that had been cleaned to perfection just hours earlier. The walls were lined with photographs of distinguished visitors, award ceremonies, and formal military portraits dating back decades. Each image was perfectly aligned, perfectly lit, and presented in identical frames that had probably been purchased in bulk from the same government contractor. The air conditioning hummed at exactly the right temperature to keep everyone comfortable without being noticeable, and the lighting was the kind of institutional fluorescent that made everything look slightly unreal, like a movie set designed to represent military professionalism. Every piece of furniture was positioned according to some invisible grid. Every plant was healthy and properly watered. Every notice board was updated with the latest information arranged in regulation fonts and spacing. Personnel moved through the corridors with the measured pace of people who knew they were always being observed and evaluated. Their uniforms were immaculate, every crease sharp enough to cut paper, every piece of brass gleaming, every insignia positioned with mathematical precision. Hair was regulation perfect, posture was textbook straight, and conversations were conducted in the kind of professional tones that never rose above the level of respectful efficiency. This was a world where military bearing meant everything because military action meant very little. Most of the soldiers at Fort Meridian would never see combat, never face the kind of life or death decisions that defined military service in operational theaters. Instead, they fought battles against paperwork backlogs, won victories through efficient processing times, and measured their success in terms of inspection scores and administrative metrics. It was important work, the kind of behind-the-scenes coordination that kept the entire military machine functioning. But it created a culture where appearance often mattered more than capability. The visitors center occupied a corner of the main lobby, its glass-walled office providing clear sight lines to anyone entering or leaving the building. Staff Sergeant Jennifer Hawthorne managed the visitor processing station with the kind of methodical precision that had earned her 3 consecutive commendations for administrative excellence. Her desk was organized with military geometry, forms in perfect stacks, pens aligned like soldiers in formation, computer monitor positioned at exactly the regulation angle for optimal viewing, and professional appearance. Hawthorne had been at Fort Meridian for 6 years, long enough to develop an instinctive ability to categorize visitors within seconds of their arrival. She could distinguish between the nervous family members visiting for the first time, the confident contractors who knew the system, the official visitors whose credentials commanded immediate respect, and the occasional problem cases who would require careful handling to maintain the base's reputation for smooth operations. The morning shift had started. Like any other, a handful of routine visitor requests, some equipment deliveries that needed escort authorization, and the usual stream of personnel returning from leave with travel documentation to be verified and filed. Everything was running according to schedule, every process flowing through its established channels. When Elena Vasquez walked through the main entrance and into an environment that would soon be turned completely upside down, the lobby's carefully maintained silence was broken only by the soft clicking of keyboards, the occasional rustle of paperwork, and the distant sound of air conditioning units cycling on and off. It was the kind of peaceful, controlled atmosphere that Fort Meridian took pride in maintaining. Professional, efficient, and utterly predictable. But sometimes, predictability is exactly what sets the stage for the most unexpected events. Elena Vasquez approached the visitor center with the kind of purposeful stride that came from 8 years of military service, though the exhaustion from her all-night drive had softened her usual razor-sharp precision. At 31, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to navigate both the bureaucratic maze of military administration, and the unforgiving reality of field operations. Her dark hair, pulled back in a regulation bun that had somehow survived 18 hours in a car, showed just the faintest traces of premature gray at the temples, the kind of stress markers that came from responsibilities most soldiers her age never had to shoulder. The wrinkles in her BDS told a story of urgency and dedication, but they also concealed a service record that would have impressed even the most seasoned officers at Fort Meridian. Elena had enlisted at 18, fresh out of high school, in a small New Mexico town, where military service was often the only path to college and a better life. What started as a practical decision had evolved into something much deeper when her aptitude scores and psychological evaluations caught the attention of recruiters who were looking for a very specific type of soldier. Her official military occupational specialty was listed as 31B Military Police, a designation that appeared on every piece of routine paperwork and personnel file that moved through normal military channels. It was a respectable field, important work that involved everything from base security to criminal investigations, and it explained her assignment to Mountain Pine Training Facility, where MP skills were essential for managing the challenging environment and diverse personnel involved. In survival training programs. But Elena's actual service record was far more complex than her official designation suggested. 3 years into her enlistment, she had been approached by a quietly professional woman in civilian clothes who had introduced herself only as Dr. Martinez from Personnel Development. The conversation that followed had been unlike anything Elena had experienced in her military career. Questions about her family background, her language skills, her ability to adapt to unfamiliar environments, and her psychological resilience under extreme stress. Dr. Martinez had been particularly interested in Elena's childhood. Growing up in a family where both parents were first-generation immigrants, Elena had learned to navigate between worlds from an early age. She was fluent in Spanish and English, comfortable with both cultures, and had developed the kind of social adaptability that came from constantly translating not just languages but entire ways of thinking between her family and the broader American community. These skills, Dr. Martinez had explained, were exactly what certain specialized units were looking for. The training that followed had taken place at facilities that didn't appear on any official maps, under instructors whose names were never recorded in any personnel files Elena ever saw. She learned advanced surveillance techniques, cultural infiltration methods, and communication protocols that existed entirely outside normal military channels. The program had an innocuous designation, Cultural Liaison Specialist, but Elena quickly understood that she was being prepared for assignments that would never appear in her official service record. Her first deployment under this new role had taken her to a region of Afghanistan where American forces were struggling to build relationships with local tribal leaders. Elena's job, officially, was to serve as a translator and cultural advisor. Unofficially, she was gathering intelligence on smuggling networks that were funding insurgent operations across 3 provinces. For 8 months, she had lived in conditions that made Fort Meridian's administrative challenges seem like luxury accommodations, operating under a cover identity so carefully constructed that even some of her fellow soldiers didn't know her real mission. The success of that deployment had led to others. Elena found herself moving through a shadow world of military operations that existed parallel to, but separate from, the conventional Army structure. She carried 2 sets of identification documents, maintained cover stories that were updated quarterly, and had learned to compartmentalize her life in ways that would have been impossible for most people. Her official records showed a competent but unremarkable MP with routine assignments and standard evaluations. Her classified files told a very different story. Between these special assignments, Elena was rotated back to conventional duties to maintain her cover and provide what the program administrators called operational decompression, Mountain Pine Training facility had been one of these assignments, though even there her skills had been utilized in ways that went beyond the standard job description. The survival training programs often involved personnel from various government agencies, and Elena's role frequently expanded to include discrete evaluation and reporting on candidates whose clearances were being considered for elevation. The irony of her current situation wasn't lost on her. Elena had spent years operating in environments where the wrong word or inappropriate behavior could compromise operations that affected national security. She had maintained perfect operational security while living under assumed identities. For months at a time, she had been trusted with intelligence so sensitive that its unauthorized disclosure would have been considered an act of treason. And now she was about to be judged by soldiers who had never left the Continental United States because her uniform showed wrinkles from a family emergency. The emergency leave documentation in her jacket pocket represented just one layer of her presence at Fort Meridian. Buried deeper in her orders, accessible only to personnel with appropriate clearances, was authorization for Elena to conduct what was euphemistically termed administrative coordination with certain classified programs managed through Meridian's communications infrastructure. Even her family emergency was being utilized as operational cover for activities that would never appear in any official logs. As Elena approached Staff Sergeant Hawthorne's desk, she moved with the measured calm of someone who had learned to hide complexity behind simplicity, to present an unremarkable exterior while carrying responsibilities that most people couldn't imagine. She had no way of knowing that within the hour, circumstances would force some of those hidden depths into the light, or that the carefully constructed boundaries between her official and classified identities were about to be shattered by events completely beyond her control. The battle dress uniform that Elena wore told multiple stories, though most observers would only see the most obvious one. The standard woodland camouflage pattern was regulation correct, the sizing appropriate, and all the basic elements were properly positioned according to Army standards. But for those who knew how to look, the uniform carried details that marked it as something far more significant than standard-issue military clothing. The fabric itself was the first clue, though it would take an expert eye to notice the difference. While it appeared to be standard Army-issue material, the weave was actually a specialized blend that had been developed for personnel operating in environments where durability and performance mattered more than appearance. The fabric was designed to resist tearing, shed moisture more effectively, and maintain its structural integrity under conditions that would destroy conventional military clothing. It was the kind of upgrade that was provided only to units whose missions took them far beyond the comfortable boundaries of standard military installations. Elena's name tape read Vasquez in the standard black lettering on olive drab background, positioned precisely above her right breast pocket, according to regulations that every soldier learned in basic training. But the tape itself was attached with a different type of adhesive than the standard issue, one that could be removed quickly and completely without leaving residue or damage to the uniform. It was a small detail, the kind of modification that would be invisible to casual inspection, but essential for personnel who might need to alter their identification quickly and cleanly in operational environments. The rank insignia on her collar showed the 3 chevrons and crossed rifles of a staff sergeant, properly aligned and appropriately aged to match her years of service. But the metal itself was a slightly different alloy than standard issue, one that wouldn't reflect light as readily and was less likely to create the kind of glints that could compromise concealment in field conditions. Again, it was a modification, so subtle that it would pass any routine inspection while providing functional advantages that most soldiers would never need. Above her left breast pocket, Elena wore the standard U.S. Army tape that identified her branch of service, but positioned just below it was a small rectangular patch that would puzzle most military personnel. The patch was predominantly black with subtle gray striping, bearing what appeared to be a stylized geometric design that could have been mistaken for decorative elements by anyone unfamiliar with specialized military symbology. The design actually represented topographical features of a specific region in Central Asia, rendered in a code that was known only to personnel who had operated in that area under classified protocols. To the casual observer, it looked like one of the many unit patches or specialized training badges that soldiers accumulated throughout their careers. Military personnel were accustomed to seeing unfamiliar insignia, especially at a base like Fort Meridian, where soldiers from dozens of different units and specialties rotated through on temporary assignments. Most people would assume it was related to some training course or unit assignment they weren't familiar with, and wouldn't think to question it further. But this particular patch had never been available through normal military supply channels. It had been hand-produced in small quantities by a contractor whose facilities were located in an unmarked building outside Washington, D.C., and it was issued only to personnel whose clearances had been verified through channels that existed entirely outside the conventional military personnel system. The patch carried no official designation, appeared in no regulation manuals, and was not listed in any database that could be accessed through normal military information systems. The positioning of Elena's various badges and insignia followed a pattern that would look regulation correct to any standard inspection, but actually communicated information to those who knew how to read it. The slight spacing between certain elements, the precise alignment of her ribbons, even the way her collar was positioned, all conveyed coded information about her actual assignments and clearance levels. It was a system of visual communication that had been developed for use in environments where personnel might need to identify each other without verbal contact or electronic verification. Elena's combat boots showed the kind of wear patterns that came from serious field use rather than garrison duty. The leather had been treated with compounds that weren't available through normal supply channels, giving it enhanced water resistance and durability. The laces were slightly thicker than standard issue and made from a material that was virtually impossible to break under normal circumstances. Even the way the boots were laced followed a specific pattern that indicated specialized training and operational experience. The most significant element of Elena's uniform, however, was also the most invisible. Sewn into the lining of her jacket, positioned where it would never be noticed during routine inspections, but could be accessed quickly if necessary, was a small fabric strip containing information that existed nowhere else in the world. The strip bore a code designation that was known only to a handful of people in the Pentagon, along with authentication sequences that could verify Elena's identity and clearance level through classified communication channels. This code strip represented Elena's true military identity, the one that existed parallel to and separate from her official personnel records. It connected her to operations that had never been publicly acknowledged, to missions that would never appear in any historical records, and to a network of personnel whose real contributions to national security would never be recognized or celebrated in any public forum. The wrinkles in travel wear that made Elena's uniform the subject of whispered criticism were actually covering elements that marked her as one of the military's most trusted and capable operatives. But in the sterile environment of Fort Meridian, where appearance often mattered more than substance, those crucial details would remain invisible until circumstances forced them into the light. The whispers started before Elena had even reached Staff Sergeant Hawthorne's desk. In the carefully controlled environment of Fort Meridian's main administrative building, where every sound seemed amplified by the polished surfaces and regulated atmosphere, even the quietest comments carried further than their speakers intended. The first voice belonged to Specialist Ryan Kowalski, a 23-year-old administrative clerk who had been stationed at Fort Meridian for 18 months, without ever setting foot outside the comfortable boundaries of garrison duty. "Look what the cat dragged in," Kowalski murmured to his cubicle mate, Specialist Ashley Park, his voice pitched just loud enough to ensure it would reach Elena's ears while maintaining the thin veneer of deniability that came with speaking to someone else. Park glanced up from her computer terminal, took in Elena's travel-worn appearance, and responded with the kind of knowing smirk that suggested she was about to participate in something she found genuinely entertaining. "Must have been a rough weekend," Park replied, her tone dripping with the fake sympathy that made her comment more cutting than direct insult would have been. "Some people really don't understand that the uniform represents something, you know. It's not just clothes you throw on when you feel like it." The comments were carefully calculated to avoid crossing any lines that could result in formal complaints or disciplinary action, but they were delivered with enough volume and clarity to ensure that Elena would hear every word. Both soldiers had perfected this technique over months of practicing their particular brand of garrison politics, where the ability to undermine someone without technically violating regulations was considered a valuable social skill. Sergeant First Class Marcus Thompson, who was processing travel vouchers at a nearby desk, looked up from his paperwork with the expression of someone who had just discovered an interesting form of entertainment during an otherwise routine morning. Thompson had been at Fort Meridian for 4 years, long enough to establish himself as an informal authority on military standards and proper appearance. His own uniform was pressed to razor-sharp perfection, every element positioned with the kind of obsessive precision that suggested he spent considerable time each morning ensuring that his appearance met his own exacting standards. "Field uniform on an admin base," Thompson observed, shaking his head with exaggerated disappointment. "Wonder if she knows this isn't a training exercise." His comment was addressed to the room in general, delivered with the confident tone of someone who believed his opinion carried weight and expected others to appreciate his insight into proper military deportment. The mockery was beginning to attract an audience. Private First Class David Chun, who was waiting for his own paperwork to be processed, found himself drawn into the developing situation by the obvious entertainment value it provided during what had started as a tediously routine morning. Chun had been in the Army for less than a year, but he had quickly learned that joining in when more senior soldiers were making observations about military standards was often a safe way to demonstrate that he understood and shared their values. "Maybe she got lost on the way to a camping trip," Chun added, his contribution earning approving chuckles from Kowalski and Park. The joke was derivative and predictable, but in the echo chamber of shared derision that was developing around Elena's presence, originality mattered less than participation. Staff Sergeant Jennifer Hawthorne, who was responsible for managing the visitor processing station, found herself in an uncomfortable position as she watched the situation develop. Her official role required her to maintain professional standards and ensure that all visitors were treated with appropriate courtesy. But the informal social dynamics of the office meant that appearing to defend someone who was clearly being targeted for legitimate criticism could damage her own standing with her colleagues. Hawthorne had worked hard to establish herself as someone who understood and upheld military standards, and her reputation for maintaining proper procedures had been instrumental in her receiving commendations for administrative excellence. She understood that Elena's appearance was genuinely substandard by Fort Meridian's expectations, and she found herself genuinely conflicted about how to balance her professional responsibilities with her desire to maintain her social position. Within the office hierarchy, the whispered comments were becoming bolder as more personnel became aware of the situation. Corporal Janet Williams, who managed supply requisitions from a desk positioned near the main entrance, had initially been focused on her computer screen, but found her attention drawn to Elena's appearance as she approached the visitor center. Williams had developed strong opinions about military bearing during her 3 years at Fort Meridian, and she felt genuinely offended by what she perceived as Elena's casual disregard for proper uniform standards. "Looks like someone needs a refresher course on military appearance regulations," Williams commented to Sergeant Thompson, her voice carrying enough authority to suggest that she considered herself qualified to make such assessments. I mean, if you're going to wear the uniform, at least show it some respect. The building momentum of criticism was creating exactly the kind of situation that Elena had hoped to avoid. What should have been a simple, quick processing of visitor credentials was becoming a public spectacle, with each new voice adding to the chorus of disapproval and making it increasingly difficult for anyone to step back from the developing confrontation. Elena could feel the weight of their attention, the way conversations were pausing as people took notice of her presence and began forming their own judgments about her appearance and, by extension, her character and professionalism. The administrative building's pristine environment made her travel-worn uniform stand out even more starkly, and she found herself becoming an unwilling focal point for every person's opinions about military standards and proper behavior. Irony of the situation was becoming almost overwhelming. Elena had spent years operating in environments where these same soldiers would have been completely out of their depth, where the kind of attention to superficial details that they prized so highly would have been not just irrelevant but potentially dangerous. But in this carefully controlled world of administrative efficiency and regulatory compliance, their narrow expertise gave them confidence to judge someone whose actual qualifications and experience far exceeded anything they had ever encountered. What had started as whispered observations was rapidly evolving into something much more public and pointed. The initial comments about Elena's appearance had broken the morning's professional atmosphere, and now soldiers throughout the administrative building were finding excuses to drift closer to the visitor processing area, drawn by the entertainment value of watching someone being systematically taken down by their peers. Sergeant First Class Thompson had apparently decided that his earlier comment hadn't been sufficiently devastating, because he stood up from his desk and approached Elena's position with the confident stride of someone who believed he was about to deliver a teachable moment. His own uniform was so perfectly pressed that it looked like it had been constructed from cardboard rather than fabric, every crease sharp enough to serve as a cutting instrument, every piece of brass polished to a mirror finish that caught and reflected the overhead lighting. "You know," Thompson announced, his voice now loud enough to address the entire room rather than just his immediate colleagues, "I've been thinking about this situation, and I'm genuinely curious about something." He paused for effect, ensuring that he had captured the attention of everyone within earshot before continuing with his performance. "Are you actually on active duty, or is this some kind of reserve weekend warrior situation? Because I'm having trouble understanding how anyone with real military experience could think that appearance is acceptable on a professional installation." The comment drew appreciative chuckles from several directions, and Elena could feel the attention of the room focusing on her with increasing intensity. Thompson's implication was clear and calculated. He was suggesting that her appearance indicated either inexperience or a lack of commitment to military standards, and he was doing it in a way that invited others to join in his assessment. Specialist Park, emboldened by Thompson's more aggressive approach, decided to contribute her own observations. "I was stationed at Fort Bragg before this," she announced, as if her previous assignment gave her special authority to comment on military standards. "And let me tell you, they would never have allowed someone to walk around looking like they'd been sleeping in their car. Standards are standards, regardless of what your excuse might be." The reference to sleeping in a car was particularly cutting, because it was uncomfortably close to Elena's actual situation, and Park's delivery suggested that she considered this possibility both amusing and indicative of Elena's character. The comment also carried the implicit suggestion that Elena's appearance was the result of laziness or poor planning rather than legitimate circumstances. Corporal Williams had abandoned any pretense of working and was now openly staring at Elena with the kind of professional disapproval that suggested she was personally offended by the situation. "You know what bothers me most about this?" Williams asked, addressing her question to the room in general while keeping her eyes fixed on Elena. It's the disrespect to everyone else who takes pride in their appearance. When you show up looking like that, you're basically saying that military standards don't matter, that the rest of us are wasting our time caring about professionalism. The accusation of disrespect was particularly effective because it reframed the situation in moral terms rather than simply aesthetic ones. Williams was suggesting that Elena's appearance wasn't just a personal failing, but an active insult to everyone who maintained proper standards, and this interpretation was clearly resonating with her audience. Private Chun, who had been content to observe the developing situation, found himself swept up in the momentum of collective criticism. "My drill sergeant would have made us do push-ups until we puked if any of us had shown up looking like that," he contributed, his voice carrying the enthusiasm of someone who was excited to participate in what felt like a legitimate military training moment. I mean, basic standards are called basic for a reason, right? The reference to basic training was intended to suggest that Elena was failing to meet even the most fundamental expectations of military service, and Chun's delivery implied that her appearance represented a regression to pre-military civilian standards. It was the kind of criticism that was designed to be particularly stinging to anyone who took pride in their military identity. Staff Sergeant Hawthorne was finding her position increasingly difficult to maintain. Her professional responsibilities required her to process Elena's visitor credentials efficiently and courteously, but the developing consensus among her colleagues made it clear that defending Elena would be seen as defending substandard performance. Hawthorne had worked too hard to establish her reputation for maintaining proper standards to risk damaging it for someone whose appearance genuinely violated Fort Meridian's expectations. "Ma'am," Hawthorne said, her tone carrying the kind of forced politeness that managed to sound more insulting than direct hostility, "I'm going to need to see your identification and any authorization documents you might have. And I should probably mention that Fort Meridian maintains certain standards for visitors that might be different from what you're used to at other installations." The implication was clear. Hawthorne was suggesting that Elena might be unfamiliar with proper military standards, and that Fort Meridian operated at a higher level of professionalism than wherever Elena had come from. It was a diplomatically phrased insult that allowed Hawthorne to maintain her professional demeanor while still participating in the fighting. Collective criticism. The audience that had gathered around the visitor processing area was growing larger and more confident in their judgments. Soldiers who had initially been focused on their own work were now openly watching the situation unfold, and their expressions ranged from amused superiority to genuine outrage at what they perceived as Elena's casual disregard for military standards. Collective momentum of criticism was creating a situation where anyone who might have been inclined to defend Elena or suggest alternative explanations for her appearance would have found themselves swimming against a powerful current of shared opinion. The group dynamic had reached the point where challenging the consensus would have required significant social courage and would have risked being seen as defending unacceptable standards. Elena stood in the center of this developing storm of criticism, maintaining her composure while being systematically torn down by people who had no understanding of her actual qualifications or the circumstances that had brought her to Fort Meridian. The irony of the situation was becoming almost surreal. She was being lectured about military standards by soldiers whose entire careers had been spent in the protected environment of administrative assignments. People who had never faced the kind of challenges that made uniform appearance irrelevant compared to mission accomplishment. Elena placed her emergency leave documentation on Staff Sergeant Hawthorne's desk with the measured calm of someone who had learned to navigate bureaucratic obstacles without betraying frustration or desperation. The papers were properly folded, appropriately signed, and contained all the necessary authorization codes that should have made her visitor processing routine and straightforward. but in the current atmosphere of collective criticism and professional disapproval, even legitimate paperwork was about to become another weapon in the systematic dismantling of her credibility. Hawthorne picked up the documents with the kind of exaggerated care that suggested she was handling something potentially contaminated, her expression already skeptical before she had read a single line. The performance was clearly intended for the benefit of her audience, a way of demonstrating that she approached her responsibilities with appropriate suspicion and thoroughness. She unfolded the first page slowly, her eyes scanning the text, with the deliberate pace of someone who is determined to find problems rather than facilitate solutions. "Emergency leave authorization," Hawthorne announced to the room, her tone carrying the kind of professional skepticism that suggested she encountered fraudulent documentation on a regular basis. "Signed by Colonel Hendricks at Mountain Pine Training Facility." She paused, allowing the name and location to register with her colleagues before continuing her examination. "Travel orders for family emergency. Authorization for base access at Fort Meridian for purposes of hospital visitation." The way Hawthorne read the documentation aloud transformed what should have been routine verification into a public interrogation, with each detail subjected to implicit questioning and potential challenge. Her delivery suggested that she was providing her colleagues with the information they would need to form their own judgments about the legitimacy and appropriateness of Elena's presence on the base. Sergeant Thompson, who had positioned himself where he could see the paperwork over Hawthorne's shoulder, immediately seized on what he perceived as an opportunity to demonstrate his expertise in regulatory compliance. "Mountain Pine Training Facility," he repeated, his voice carrying the tone of someone who had just identified a significant problem. "That's one of those remote assignments where they basically make up their own rules, isn't it? I've heard stories about those places. Soldiers going months without proper inspections. Standards getting relaxed because of operational requirements." The air quotes around operational requirements were delivered with the kind of dismissive sarcasm that suggested Thompson considered such justifications to be convenient excuses for lazy leadership and declining standards. His comment was designed to undermine the credibility of Elena's entire chain of command, and by extension, any documentation they might have produced. Hawthorne was now examining the paperwork with the intensity of a forensic specialist searching for evidence of forgery. She held individual pages up to the light, checking watermarks and security features with theatrical thoroughness. Her computer terminal displayed the Fort Meridian Visitor Management System, a complex database that cross-referenced authorization codes with approved personnel lists and security clearances. "I'm showing some irregularities in the system," Hawthorne announced after several minutes of typing and clicking through various screens. Her voice carried the satisfaction of someone who had successfully identified a legitimate problem that would justify the skepticism she had been displaying. "The authorization codes are unusual. They're not coming up in our standard verification database." The word irregular hung in the air like an accusation, and Elena could feel the collective attention of the room focusing on her with renewed intensity. In the bureaucratic world of Fort Meridian, irregular documentation was tantamount to suspected fraud, and Hawthorne's announcement provided official validation for all the criticism that had been building throughout the morning. Corporal Williams, who had been listening intently to the entire exchange, stepped forward with the confidence of someone who believed she was about to contribute valuable insight to an important investigation. "You know, I've been processing visitor authorizations for 3 years," she announced, "and I've never seen codes like those. Usually when we get documentation that doesn't match our systems, it's because someone is trying to use outdated forms. Or other issues." The pause before "other issues" was loaded with implication, suggesting forgery, fraud, or other serious violations without making direct accusations that could result in formal complaints. Williams had perfected the art of character assassination through administrative procedure, and she was clearly enjoying the opportunity to apply her skills to someone who had already been marked as problematic. Private Chun, emboldened by the apparent discovery of official irregularities, decided to share his own observations about the documentation. "Those travel orders look like they were processed really quickly," he noted, examining the timestamps and signatures visible on Elena's paperwork. "Usually emergency leave takes at least 24 hours to get proper authorization. This looks like it was all done in a couple of hours." Chun's comment was intended to suggest that Elena's documentation had been rushed through proper channels in a way that compromised normal verification procedures. The implication was that either Elena had received inappropriate special treatment, or that her paperwork had been processed without adequate oversight, both of which would call into question the legitimacy of her presence at Fort Meridian. Hawthorne was now making phone calls, contacting various administrative offices to verify Elena's documentation through alternative channels. Each call became a public performance, with Hawthorne describing Elena's appearance and circumstances to whoever answered the phone, effectively broadcasting her situation to multiple offices throughout the base's administrative network. "Yes, I have someone here claiming emergency leave authorization," Hawthorne said into her phone, her voice carrying clearly through the office space. "The documentation appears legitimate, but the authorization codes aren't matching our standard verification protocols. Can you run these numbers through your system and see if they correspond to any active personnel assignments?" The bureaucratic machinery of Fort Meridian was now fully engaged in questioning Elena's right to be on the base, with multiple offices and personnel becoming involved in what should have been a simple visitor processing procedure. Each additional layer of verification created more opportunities for delay, more chances for problems to be identified, and more people who would form opinions about Elena's credibility based on the circumstances of her arrival. The systematic nature of the challenges Elena was facing had transformed her simple request for visitor credentials into a complex administrative investigation, with her documentation being subjected to levels of scrutiny that were rarely applied to routine requests. The bureaucratic barrier that was being constructed around her presence was becoming increasingly difficult to overcome, and each new obstacle provided additional validation for the criticism and suspicion that had been building since her arrival. Elena stood in the center of this expanding web of administrative challenges, maintaining her composure while watching the very systems that were supposed to facilitate her legitimate business being turned against her by people who had already decided that her appearance indicated deeper problems with her character and professionalism. The first sign that something was shifting came from an unexpected source. Chief Warrant Officer Gregory Novak had been working quietly at his desk in the corner of the administrative building, focused on coordinating communications protocols for an upcoming joint training exercise. Novak was the kind of professional who rarely involved himself in office politics or casual conversations, preferring to maintain his focus on the complex technical requirements of his position. He had spent 15 years working with classified communication systems, and his job required him to interface with military units across multiple branches of service and security. Classifications. Novak had initially paid no attention to the commotion surrounding Elena's visitor processing, dismissing it as the kind of routine administrative drama that seemed to emerge regularly in garrison environments where soldiers had too much time and too little meaningful work to occupy their attention. But something had caught his peripheral vision as he glanced up from his computer screen, something that made him stop what he was doing and focus his attention on the woman who was being systematically dismantled by his colleagues. It wasn't Elena's overall appearance that had captured Novak's attention. He had seen plenty of soldiers who looked worse after legitimate field operations or emergency situations. What had stopped him cold was a specific detail that most people would never notice, a small element of Elena's uniform that meant absolutely nothing to the vast Majority of military personnel, but carried profound significance for someone with Novak's background and clearances. The black patch on Elena's left breast pocket, the one that looked like decorative unit insignia to casual observers, had triggered a memory that sent a chill down Novak's spine. He had seen that pattern before, years ago, in a briefing room that officially didn't exist, during a meeting that had never been recorded in any official logs. The geometric design that others might mistake for abstract decoration was actually a precise representation of terrain features from a specific region, rendered in a code that was known only to personnel who had been briefed on certain operations in Central Asia. Novak's hand stopped moving across his keyboard as he tried to process what he was seeing. The patch Elena wore was not something that could be purchased through any normal supply channels, not something that could be fabricated by someone seeking to enhance their military credentials with fake insignia. It was produced by a specialized contractor under protocols so restrictive that even ordering the materials required clearances that most general officers didn't possess. But there was more. As Novak continued to observe Elena's uniform with growing intensity, he began to notice other details that would be invisible to anyone without extensive experience in classified operations. The way her name tape was positioned, the precise spacing of her ribbons, even the manner in which her collar was arranged, all followed patterns that weren't covered in any regulation, manual, but were taught only to personnel being prepared for assignments that required them to identify each other through visual cues alone. Novak reached for his secure phone, a communication device that was connected to networks entirely separate from the base's standard telephone system. His access to these systems was part of his role in coordinating classified communications, but he had never expected to use them to verify the identity of someone being processed as a routine visitor. He hesitated for a moment, aware that his next actions would either confirm his growing suspicions or reveal him as someone who had allowed his imagination to overcome his professional judgment. The number he dialed was answered immediately by a voice that identified itself only with a numeric code. Novak provided his own authentication sequence, then described the insignia he was observing in terms that would mean nothing to anyone monitoring unsecured communications, but would be immediately understood by anyone with appropriate clearances. "Stand by for verification," the voice on the phone instructed, and Novak could hear the sound of computer keyboards and database searches being conducted on the other end of the connection. The verification process took several minutes, during which Novak maintained his observation of Elena while his colleagues continued their systematic destruction of her credibility. Master Sergeant Lisa Rodriguez, who managed classified document processing for Fort Meridian's Intelligence Coordination Office, had been walking through the administrative building when she noticed the unusual intensity of Novak's attention to the visitor processing area. Rodriguez had worked with Novak on several classified projects, and she had learned to recognize when his technical expertise was detecting something that others were missing. Rodriguez approached Novak's desk quietly, aware that any conversation involving his secure communication systems would need to be conducted with appropriate discretion. "Something interesting about our visitor?" she asked, her voice pitched low enough to avoid drawing attention from the continuing drama at Hawthorne's desk. Novak covered the phone's microphone with his hand and turned to Rodriguez with an expression that combined professional concern with genuine bewilderment. "That patch she's wearing," he said quietly, "it's not what it appears to be. I'm running verification now, but if I'm right about what I'm seeing, that woman is not who everyone thinks she is." The voice on Novak's secure phone returned with information that made his expression shift from concern to something approaching. "Alarm. Verification complete," the voice reported. "Subject is authenticated for Umbra 7 protocols under operational designation Nighthawk Delta 7. Current assignment status is classified above your clearance level, but her presence At your location has been flagged for immediate notification to appropriate command authorities. Rodriguez had been watching Novak's face during the phone conversation, and his reaction told her everything she needed to know about the significance of what was unfolding. "How immediate is immediate?" she asked, already understanding that the morning's entertainment was about to become something much more serious. Novak was still processing the implications of what he had just learned when his secure phone rang again. This time, the caller identification showed a priority level that made him straighten in his chair before answering. The voice that spoke was calm, but carried the kind of authority that made it clear this was not a routine administrative call. "Chief." "Novak, this is Colonel Brighton from Intelligence Coordination. We've been monitoring your verification request, and we need you to understand that the individual you're observing is operating under protocols that supersede normal base procedures. Under no circumstances should her operational security be compromised by continued public scrutiny. Is that understood?" Novak's eyes moved from his phone to Elena, who was still standing at Hawthorne's desk while being subjected to increasingly aggressive questioning about her documentation and appearance. The irony of the situation was becoming almost overwhelming. A woman with clearances that exceeded those of most people in the building was being treated like a security risk because her uniform showed wrinkles from traveling to a family emergency. "Understood, sir," Novak replied. But he could see that the situation at the visitor processing desk was continuing to escalate, with more personnel joining the chorus of criticism and Hawthorne's phone calls, expanding the circle of people who were questioning Elena's legitimacy. Something was going to have to be done, and it was going to have to be done quickly, before the morning's entertainment became a genuine threat to operational security. The morning's routine was shattered by the sound of heavy footsteps echoing through the administrative building's main corridor, footsteps that carried a rhythm and authority that made every soldier in the vicinity instinctively straighten their posture and reduce their voices to whispers. The sound was unmistakable to anyone with even minimal military experience, the measured pace of someone accustomed to command, the confident stride of an officer whose presence could alter the dynamics of any situation simply by entering the room. Major General Patricia Hawkins entered the administrative building with the kind of purposeful energy that suggested she was responding to something urgent rather than conducting a routine inspection or casual visit. At 54 years old, General Hawkins carried herself with the quiet confidence that came from 3 decades of military service, including combat deployments that had earned her decorations most officers only dreamed of receiving. Her uniform was impeccable without being ostentatious, bearing the kind of understated perfection that indicated genuine professionalism rather than garrison showmanship. Hawkins had not planned to visit the administrative building that morning. Her schedule had called for a series of briefings at the Intelligence Coordination Facility, followed by a conference call with Pentagon officials regarding upcoming joint operations in the Pacific Theater. But the secure communication that had reached her 20 minutes earlier had changed everything, alerting her to a situation that required immediate personal attention and potentially threatened operational security at levels that most of the personnel at Fort Meridian couldn't even imagine. The general's aide, Captain James Morrison, followed 2 steps behind her with the kind of precise positioning that indicated both military protocol and genuine respect for his commanding officer. Morrison carried a leather portfolio containing classified documents related to the situation they were responding to, materials that had been hastily compiled from multiple databases and security networks after Chief Novak's verification requests had triggered automated alerts throughout the intelligence community. As General Hawkins moved through the building, the effect of her presence rippled outward like stones thrown into still water. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Soldiers found sudden reasons to check their uniform appearance, and the casual atmosphere that had characterized the morning's activities transformed into something much more formal and attentive. Even personnel who worked directly in her path seemed to sense that something significant was happening, and the building's ambient noise level dropped noticeably as people became aware that they were witnessing an unusual event. The general's expression was carefully neutral, giving no indication of her thoughts or intentions as she approached the visitor processing area where Elena continued to endure systematic questioning of her credentials and appearance. Hawkins had reviewed Elena's classified files during the brief drive from the intelligence facility, and the discrepancy between Elena's actual qualifications and the treatment she was receiving represented exactly the kind of operational security failure that could have far-reaching consequences. Sergeant Thompson, who had been lecturing Elena about the importance of maintaining proper military standards even during emergency situations, became aware of General Hawkins' approach and immediately shifted his attention to ensuring that his own appearance met the exacting standards he had been advocating. His transition from confident critic to nervous subordinate was almost instantaneous, and his voice trailed off mid-sentence as he struggled to process the implications of a general's unexpected arrival. Staff Sergeant Hawthorne, who had been conducting increasingly aggressive phone calls to verify Elena's documentation, found herself in the awkward position of having to conclude a conversation in which she had been describing Elena as a potential security risk to someone in the personnel office. The irony of questioning someone's credentials while a general approached to personally intervene was not lost on her, and she began to suspect that the morning's entertainment was about to become a career-defining moment in ways she had never intended. General Hawkins stopped directly in front of Elena, her presence creating an immediate zone of silence that extended throughout the administrative building. The casual conversations and routine business that had provided the background soundtrack for the morning's activities ceased entirely, replaced by the kind of attentive quiet that indicated everyone present understood they were witnessing something unprecedented. "Staff Sergeant Vasquez," General Hawkins said, her voice carrying clearly through the now silent space. The use of Elena's name and rank immediately signaled to everyone present that this was not a casual encounter or routine inspection, but a specific interaction between the general and someone whose identity she knew in advance. The implications of a general knowing a supposedly problematic visitor's name and rank created a sudden shift in the room's dynamics that was almost physically palpable. Captain Morrison positioned himself slightly behind and to the right of General Hawkins, his presence serving both protocol requirements and practical considerations related to the classified nature of the situation they were addressing. Morrison's portfolio remained closed, but his positioning indicated that he was prepared to provide documentation or verification if the situation required it. The soldiers who had been participating in Elena's systematic criticism found themselves in an increasingly uncomfortable position as they began to understand that their morning's entertainment might have been based on fundamental misunderstandings about Elena's actual status and qualifications. The confidence and authority they had displayed while questioning her appearance and credentials evaporated as they faced the possibility that they had been publicly criticizing someone whose importance far exceeded anything they had imagined. General Hawkins' attention was focused entirely on Elena, but her peripheral awareness extended throughout the room, taking in the expressions and body language of everyone who had been involved in the morning's activities. Years of command experience had taught her to read situations quickly and accurately, and she could see that the administrative personnel had created exactly the kind of public spectacle that operational security protocols were designed to prevent. Chief Novak, who had been monitoring the situation through his secure communications networks, watched the general's arrival with a mixture of relief and apprehension. His verification requests had set in motion a chain of events that was now beyond his control, and he understood that the next few minutes would determine whether the morning's activities would be resolved quietly or would escalate into the kind of incident that generated official investigations and formal reports. The administrative building had been transformed from a routine workplace into something approaching a military ceremony, with everyone present instinctively understanding that they were witnesses to an event that would be remembered and discussed for years to come. The only question remaining was whether they would remember it as participants in a significant embarrassment or as witnesses to a remarkable demonstration of how quickly military hierarchies could shift when operational realities superseded garrison politics. General Hawkins stepped closer to Elena, her movement deliberate and measured, creating a tension in the room that was almost electric. The silence that had fallen over the administrative building was so complete that the distant hum of air conditioning units seemed amplified, and every person present found themselves holding their breath as they witnessed what was clearly about to become a defining moment in Fort Meridian's recent history. "I need to see your operational identification," General Hawkins said quietly, her voice pitched low enough that only Elena and the immediate vicinity could hear her words clearly. The request was phrased as a routine instruction, but the implications were staggering to anyone who understood military protocol. Generals did not personally request operational identification from staff sergeants unless those staff sergeants possessed credentials that existed far outside normal military hierarchies. Elena reached into her jacket pocket, her movements careful and precise as she withdrew a small leather wallet that looked identical to standard military identification holders. But instead of the routine ID card that everyone expected, she produced a document that was unlike anything most of the observers had ever seen. The identification bore Elena's photograph and basic information, but the formatting, security features, and authorization codes were completely different from standard military credentials. General Hawkins examined the identification carefully, her expression remaining neutral as she verified details that would mean nothing to casual observers but carried profound significance for someone with her clearances and experience. After several moments of scrutiny, she handed the document back to Elena and turned to address the room with the kind of authority that brooked no questions or challenges. "Ladies and gentlemen," General Hawkins announced, her voice now carrying clearly throughout the building, "I want to introduce you to someone whose service record most of you will never be cleared to read in its entirety." She paused, allowing the weight of that statement to settle over her audience before continuing. "Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez operates under the designation Nighthawk Delta 7, and she has spent the last 8 years conducting operations that exist at classification levels above most of your clearances." The revelation hit the assembled soldiers like a physical blow. Nighthawk Delta 7 was not a designation that appeared in any public military documents or standard reference materials, but several of the more senior personnel present had heard whispered references to operations conducted by units whose very existence was compartmentalized beyond normal security protocols. The realization that they had been criticizing someone whose actual credentials far exceeded their own was beginning to sink in with devastating clarity. General Hawkins continued her explanation, each word carefully chosen to provide necessary context while maintaining appropriate operational security. "The patch that some of you may have noticed on Sergeant Vasquez's uniform represents her service in Operations Crimson Thunder and Silent Compass, joint service missions conducted in Central Asia between 2019 and 2023. Those operations involved deep cover intelligence gathering in regions where American military presence was not officially acknowledged." Captain Morrison stepped forward and opened his leather portfolio, withdrawing a folder containing documents that bore security classifications most of the personnel present had never encountered. Sergeant Vasquez's cover identity required her to maintain dual documentation systems, Morrison explained, reading from the classified file. Her official military personnel record shows assignments and qualifications appropriate for her cover designation as a military police specialist. Her actual service record includes advanced training in cultural infiltration, deep cover intelligence operations, and survival protocols for denied area missions. The contrast between Elena's apparent qualifications and her actual capabilities was becoming starkly clear to everyone in the room. Specialist Park, who had earlier criticized Elena's appearance as evidence of poor military standards, found herself confronting the reality that she had been lecturing someone whose training had included scenarios that would have been completely beyond her comprehension or ability to survive. Sergeant Thompson, who had questioned Elena's commitment to military professionalism, was beginning to understand that his definition of military service had been embarrassingly narrow. The woman he had dismissed as a weekend warrior had actually spent years conducting missions where discovery could have resulted in international incidents or worse, and where maintaining cover identities had been literally a matter of life and death. General Hawkins turned her attention specifically to Staff Sergeant Hawthorne, who had been conducting the aggressive verification calls that had turned Elena's routine visitor processing into a public interrogation. "Sergeant Hawthorne," the general said, her tone carrying the kind of professional disappointment that was more devastating than any direct criticism. "The authorization codes that appeared irregular in your system exist in classified databases that are compartmentalized above your clearance level. Sergeant Vasquez's documentation is not just legitimate, it carries priority classifications that supersede normal base procedures." The room was beginning to comprehend the full scope of their collective error. Elena had not been trying to circumvent military standards or take advantage of relaxed regulations at remote assignments. She had been operating under protocols so classified that most of the people questioning her credentials had never been trusted with knowledge of their existence. Chief Novak, who had triggered the verification process that led to General Hawkins' intervention, found himself in the surreal position of having his suspicions confirmed in ways he had never anticipated. His recognition of Elena's specialized insignia had prevented what could have become a serious breach of operational security, but it had also revealed how easily legitimate operators could be compromised by personnel who lacked the knowledge to recognize what they were seeing. Master Sergeant Rodriguez, who had been observing the situation develop, understood better than most how close the morning's activities had come to creating genuine security problems. Elena's presence at Fort Meridian was apparently related to operations that required her to maintain cover identities even while conducting what appeared to be routine personal business, and the public scrutiny she had received could have compromised protocols that extended far beyond the base's boundaries. General Hawkins moved closer to Elena, positioning herself so that their conversation could be conducted with appropriate privacy, while still allowing the assembled personnel to understand the gravity of the situation they had created. "Sergeant Vasquez," she said, "I apologize for the treatment you've received this morning. Your operational security should never have been compromised by administrative personnel who lacked appropriate briefings on your status." The apology from a general to a staff sergeant, delivered in front of a room full of witnesses, represented a complete reversal of the morning's power dynamics. The soldiers who had been confident in their criticisms were now confronting the reality that they had not only been wrong about Elena's qualifications, but had actually created security risks through their ignorance of protocols that existed at levels far above their understanding. The aftermath of General Hawkins' revelation transformed the administrative building's atmosphere so completely that it felt like an entirely different place from the one Elena had entered just an hour earlier. The confident voices that had been dissecting her appearance and questioning her professionalism had been replaced by an uncomfortable silence, broken only by the sound of personnel quietly returning to their workstations, their movements careful and subdued as they processed the magnitude of their collective misjudgment. Staff Sergeant Hawthorne found herself in the unprecedented position of having to reverse every aspect of the visitor processing that had occupied the morning's attention. The phone call she had made to verify Elena's documentation now required follow-up conversations to explain that the earlier concerns had been resolved through command intervention, though she was careful not to provide details that might compromise operational security. Her computer terminal, which had displayed error messages and system irregularities, now showed Elena's visitor credentials approved with priority designations that Hawthorne had never encountered in 6 years of processing routine requests. "Ma'am," Hawthorne said to Elena, her voice carrying none of the skeptical authority that had characterized her earlier interactions, "your base access credentials are approved for unlimited duration, with escort waiver and priority facility." Access. She paused, struggling to find appropriate words for a situation that had moved far beyond her normal experience. "And I apologize for the delays this morning. Your documentation has been verified through appropriate channels." The apology was carefully worded to avoid admitting specific errors, while acknowledging that the morning's proceedings had been inappropriate. But everyone present understood the deeper implications of Hawthorne's change in demeanor. The same documentation that had been subjected to aggressive scrutiny an hour earlier was now being processed with the kind of expedited efficiency usually reserved for visiting dignitaries or personnel with emergency clearances. Specialist Park, who had earlier commented about Elena's apparent unfamiliarity with professional military standards, found herself unable to meet Elena's eyes as she organized paperwork at a nearby desk. The confidence that had fueled her participation in the morning's criticism had evaporated entirely, replaced by the uncomfortable realization that her understanding of military service had been embarrassingly limited. The woman she had dismissed as unprofessional had actually been conducting operations that existed at levels of classification and complexity that Park had never imagined. Sergeant Thompson's transformation was perhaps the most dramatic of all. The man who had lectured Elena about the importance of maintaining proper appearance standards was now moving through the office with the careful demeanor of someone who understood that his earlier behavior might have serious career implications. His perfect uniform, which had been a source of pride and authority just hours earlier, now seemed almost theatrical compared to the understated professionalism demonstrated by someone whose actual service record dwarfed his administrative achievements. "Sergeant Vasquez," Thompson approached Elena with obvious reluctance, his voice pitched low enough to avoid drawing additional attention to their conversation. "I want to apologize for my comments earlier. I didn't understand the situation, and I spoke out of turn." The apology was stilted and formal, but it represented a complete reversal from his earlier confident criticism of Elena's appearance and professionalism. Elena accepted Thompson's apology with the same quiet professionalism she had maintained throughout the morning's ordeal, but she could see the genuine distress in his expression as he confronted the reality of having publicly criticized someone whose qualifications far exceeded his own. "No harm done, Sergeant," she replied simply, though both of them understood that the morning's events would be remembered. Long after her visit to Fort Meridian had ended, General Hawkins had been observing the interactions between Elena and the PACO administrative personnel, and she stepped forward to address the broader implications of what had occurred. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her voice carrying the authority to command attention throughout the building, "I want you to understand that what happened here this morning represents exactly the kind of operational security failure that our protocols are designed to prevent." The general's statement was delivered without anger or accusation, but its implications were unmistakable to everyone present. The casual criticism and public scrutiny that had seemed like harmless garrison entertainment had actually created security risks that extended far beyond Fort Meridian's boundaries, and the personnel involved would need to understand the seriousness of their actions. Captain Morrison stepped forward with additional documentation that would formalize the morning's resolution while ensuring that appropriate lessons were learned from the incident. "Effective immediately," Morrison announced, "all personnel involved in this morning's visitor processing will receive additional briefings on operational security protocols and the identification of classified designations that may appear in Quinien. Routine administrative contexts. The mandatory training was presented as an educational opportunity rather than disciplinary action, but everyone understood that their performance would be carefully monitored to ensure that similar incidents did not occur in the future. The morning's entertainment had become a career-defining moment for everyone involved, though not in the ways they had originally anticipated. Elena gathered her approved visitor credentials and prepared to continue her original mission of reaching the base hospital where her sister Carmen was recovering. The simple task that should have taken 15 minutes had consumed nearly 2 hours and involved personnel at every level of Fort Meridian's command structure. But she was finally free to focus on the family emergency that had brought her to the base in the first place. Sergeant Vasquez, General Hawkins said as Elena prepared to leave the administrative building, "I hope your sister's recovery proceeds smoothly. And please know that your service, both official and unofficial, is recognized and appreciated at the highest levels." The general's comment was carefully phrased to acknowledge Elena's classified contributions without providing specific details that might compromise ongoing operations. As Elena walked toward the exit, the administrative building seemed to exhale. Collectively, the tension of the morning's events finally beginning to dissipate. The personnel who remained behind would spend considerable time processing what they had witnessed and learned, but they would do so with a much deeper understanding of how complex and compartmentalized modern military operations had become. Morning sun was still shining through the building's windows as Elena stepped outside, her wrinkled uniform no longer a source of criticism but a reminder that sometimes the most important military service occurs far from the pristine environments where appearances matter more than capabilities. She had come to Fort Meridian as a sister concerned about family, and she was leaving as a validated professional whose true worth had finally been recognized by those with the authority and knowledge to understand what they were seeing. The story that would be retold in military circles for years to come was not about uniform standards or administrative procedures, but about the dangers of judging people by surface appearances and the importance of understanding that military service encompasses far more than what appears in official records or routine assignments. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.